Picture this. You're standing in a cave 50,000 years ago, and a baby is born. Everyone in the group knows who the mother is. That part is obvious. But the father? There's no birth certificate. No DNA test. No surname. So how did ancient humans figure out who belonged to whom? Here's the strange part. For most of human history, paternity wasn't something you proved. It was something you decided. A woman's pregnancy was undeniable. 9 months of visible evidence. But a man's connection to a child was always, in a sense, a guess dressed up as a fact. Some early societies didn't even try to pin down a single father. They believed in something anthropologists call partible paternity, the idea that a child could have multiple biological contributors, and all the men who had relations with the mother during pregnancy were considered partial fathers, each with some responsibility for the child. Other groups went the opposite direction. They built entire social systems around making fatherhood matter intensely, because property, status, and lineage depended on it. So which approach came first? And why did human societies eventually converge on the idea of a single, identifiable father? That's what we're going to unpack. Let's start with the biological reality our ancestors were working with. Unlike most male mammals, human fathers can't simply smell or instinctively recognize their offspring. There's no scent marker, no infallible cue. Paternity in humans has always been, fundamentally, uncertain. Evolutionary biologists call this paternity uncertainty, and it shaped human behavior in ways that still echo today. Because a man couldn't know for certain a child was his, early human societies developed something almost as powerful as biology: social proof. The simplest and oldest method was proximity and exclusivity. If a man and woman were paired, living together, sharing food, sleeping in the same shelter, the community simply assumed any child born to her was his. This wasn't science. It was consensus. And consensus, in small tight-knit groups where everyone watched everyone else, was often reliable enough. This is where marriage as an institution starts to make a lot more sense. Many anthropologists argue that one of the earliest functions of marriage wasn't a romance at all. It was a paternity-assignment system. By publicly declaring a pairing, a community created a default rule. This man is the father of any children this woman has. No questions asked. No debate required. It's a strikingly elegant solution to an unsolvable problem. You can't prove biology, so you legislate certainty instead. But not every society relied purely on monogamous pairing. In some hunter-gatherer cultures, especially in parts of South America, a different model took hold entirely. Among groups like the Aché and the Curripaco in lowland South America, researchers documented something remarkable. Children with multiple possible fathers, men who had relations with the mother around the time of conception, sometimes received care, food, and protection from more than one man. The logic wasn't promiscuity for its own sake. It was risk distribution. If a child has several men who feel some stake in his survival, his odds of surviving childhood actually improve. Anthropologist Stephen Beckerman's research on this phenomenon found that children with secondary fathers had measurably higher survival rates in some of these communities. In other words, ambiguity about fatherhood wasn't always a problem ancient humans were desperate to solve. Sometimes, it was a survival strategy they leaned into on purpose. So now, we have two completely different ancient approaches. One says, lock down a single father through marriage and social agreement. The other says, spread the responsibility across multiple men and let ambiguity work in the child's favor. Why did one model eventually dominate across most of the world? The answer has a lot to do with something that didn't exist in early hunter-gatherer life: property. Once humans began farming, settling permanently, and accumulating resources, land, livestock, tools, stored grain, inheritance became a problem that needed solving. If you own land, and you die, who gets it? The answer almost universally became, your children. But that only works if you know, with confidence, who your children actually are. This single shift, from foraging to farming, is one of the most important turning points in the history of human fatherhood. Suddenly, paternal certainty wasn't just socially convenient. It was economically essential. This is when human societies start cracking down hard on female sexual behavior, when virginity, becomes culturally prized, when strict monogamy gets enforced through law and religion, and when entire moral codes form around guaranteeing that a man, children, were biologically his own. Historians and evolutionary psychologists often point to this as the root of many ancient customs that seem bizarre or harsh by modern standards. Chaperoning unmarried women, severe punishments for adultery, dowry systems, and rigid rules about who a woman could speak to or be alone with. Strip away the cultural packaging, and underneath almost all of it is the same anxious question. How do we make sure the inheritance goes to the right bloodline? It's a sobering thought. Many traditions we associate with morality or honor may have started as practical paternity assurance technology, centuries before anyone understood genetics. Speaking of paternity assurance, ancient cultures also developed less obvious tools to reinforce the idea of fatherhood, even without proof. One of the most universal is physical resemblance. Across nearly every culture in recorded history, people comment on which parent a baby looks like. This isn't trivial small talk. Researchers studying this pattern have found that comments about paternal resemblance spike dramatically right after a child is born, far more than comments about maternal resemblance. And the theory is that this serves an unconscious social function. It reassures the father, and reassures everyone watching, that the child belongs to him, whether or not the resemblance is even real. Naming traditions did similar work. In many ancient, and even modern cultures, children take the father's name, not the mother's. A surname isn't just a label, it's a public, repeated, generational announcement of paternal claim, used precisely because biological proof wasn't available. Religious and legal systems eventually formalized all of this. Roman law had a principle that essentially translated to, the husband of the mother is presumed to be the father. A rule so foundational that versions of it still exist in modern legal systems today, sometimes called the marital presumption of paternity. Ancient humans, in other words, built entire legal frameworks around the idea that social proof was the closest thing to truth they were ever going to get. Now here's where it gets genuinely strange, and a little uncomfortable. For the overwhelming majority of human history, tens of thousands of years, there was no way to actually verify if any of this social machinery was getting it right. Blood typing wasn't available until the 20th century. DNA testing didn't exist until the 1980s. For virtually all of human existence, fatherhood was a belief, reinforced by ritual, law, and social pressure, not a fact confirmed by evidence. And studies conducted after DNA testing became widely available revealed something that quietly unsettled a lot of assumptions. Estimates of non-paternity rates, cases where the presumed father turns out not to be the biological father, vary widely depending on the population studied, but multiple. Researchers have found rates ranging from under 1% in some communities to notably higher numbers in others. The ancient systems, in other words, weren't perfect. They were never meant to be perfect. They were meant to be functional enough to hold society together. This reframes the entire question we started with. Ancient humans didn't really identify fathers in the way we identify a chemical compound or a fingerprint. They constructed fatherhood through marriage, through naming, through inheritance law, through communal trust, and in some cultures, through deliberately shared responsibility among multiple men. Fatherhood, for most of human history, wasn't a biological fact waiting to be discovered. It was a social agreement everyone decided to honor, because the alternative was chaos. No inheritance system, no stable households, no clear answer to who protects and provides for the next generation. And maybe that's the real twist hiding underneath this whole question. We tend to think of paternity as something rooted purely in biology, something DNA testing finally solved in the modern era. But for the vast span of human existence, fatherhood functioned perfectly well without any biological proof at all, sustained instead by trust, ritual, and the quiet agreement of an entire community to believe in something it couldn't actually verify. So here's something worth sitting with. In a world now obsessed with DNA tests and biological certainty, ancient humans built thriving families and civilizations on a foundation of trust instead of proof, which raises an uncomfortable question for our modern, hyper-verified world. Did we gain something by demanding biological certainty, or did we lose something just as important along the way? If this made you see fatherhood differently, let me know in the comments. Would you have wanted to know the truth in ancient times? Or would you rather have lived in the comfort of not knowing? Hit like, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden psychology of human history, and I'll see you in the next one.